Chapter 1, The Invitation and the Smell Part 1. The summons to Blackwood. My name is Elias Thorne. I was, at the time, a man of facts, a man of the printed word, a journalist for the Boston Chronicle. I chased logic, dismissed the spectral, and had an arrogance common to all young men who think they've seen the worst the world has to offer. That arrogance was about to be burned out of me, replaced by a cold, gut-clenching fear that tasted like ash and iron. The year was 1898. The dispatch arrived on a Thursday, folded and sealed with black wax that smelled faintly of camphor and rot. It was a formal request, or rather, a desperate plea, from an executor in rural Georgia, a town so small it didn't merit a mention on my map. The subject, Blackwood Manor. The man who signed the letter, a lawyer named Mr. Silas Croft, needed an unbiased investigator. The late owner, a recluse named Mrs. Lenore Blackwood, had vanished 6 months prior, along with her only daughter, Clara. The local sheriff had chalked it up to flight, a wealthy woman escaping her debts, but Croft insisted something darker had transpired. He spoke of an estate that defied natural law, of servants who fled in the night, screaming about the silence. He promised a sizable fee, enough to keep my paper in print for a year. A rational man sees money. A man of my temperament sees a story. I packed my bags and my skepticism. The journey south was a blur of grinding steel and oppressive heat. The world seemed to fade as the train carried me deeper, exchanging the sounds of civilization for the heavy, moist air of the deep country. By the time I arrived at the whistle-stop town, nothing more than a general store and a saloon, I already felt an unfamiliar pressure behind my eyes. Part 2. The approach. Croft met me at the station. He was a man carved from worry, his skin sallow, his hands never still. He didn't shake my hand. He simply nodded, handed me a bag of provisions, and pointed toward a beat-up carriage pulled by an old mare. "The manor is 3 miles down the old oak road, Mr. Thorne," he rasped. "I won't be accompanying you. No one goes up there anymore. Everything you need is in the house. Just find out what happened to Clara. She was a beautiful, but frail, soul." I tried to press him for details, but his gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder, as if watching a specter in the daylight. "You'll know it when you smell it," he whispered, then turned and walked rapidly away, leaving me alone with the carriage and the immense, expectant silence of the woods. The last mile of the road was the worst. The trees' ancient moss-covered oaks formed a canopy so thick the afternoon sun became a sickly, pale wash. The air went still. All natural noise ceased. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, not even the drone of insects. The silence was total, and it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a pressure against my eardrums. And then, I smelled it. Part 3. The sickly sweet scent. It wasn't the smell of death. Not exactly. It was far stranger, more insidious. It was sweet, overpowering, like 100 baskets of overripe fruit left to rot in the sun, mixed with a metallic Thames like old blood. It clung to the air, wet and thick, and I could feel it coat the inside of my throat. It promised decay, but a lush, unnatural kind of decay. Blackwood Manor finally came into view. It was immense, a crumbling monument to old wealth and poor taste. 3 stories of dark, water-stained brick, surrounded by gardens that had long ago given up their shape and returned to a wild tangle of thorny vines. Every window was a blank, dark eye staring out from under a heavy brow of slate. I tied the mare to a cracked stone pillar near the drive and approached the front door. The air here was coldest, the smell strongest. I reached out and pushed. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked. It swung inward on hinges that made a groan like a dying animal. I stepped across the threshold, and the silence from outside was immediately amplified. It was a silence only possible inside a tomb. Part 4. The unnatural preserve. The entrance hall was vast and shadowy. Dust lay everywhere, thick and undisturbed. But what struck me was not the dust, it was the preservation. The furniture was heavy, dark wood. The velvet drapes still hung at the windows, and a bowl of faded potpourri still sat on a side table. It was as if the inhabitants had simply walked away a few hours ago, not 6 months. I checked the drawing room, the parlor. Nothing was broken, nothing was stolen. No signs of struggle, only this pervasive, sickly sweet scent. I found the caretaker's room off the kitchen. It was empty, a thin layer of dust on the bedsheet. But on the floor, tucked beneath a broken chamber pot, I found my first piece of evidence, a small, bound leather diary. It wasn't Lenore Blackwood's. The handwriting was tight and angular. It belonged to the caretaker, a man whose name was only signed as J.W. He hadn't just left the manor. He had been documenting something terrifying in its final days. I sat down, the leather cool beneath my fingers, and began to read. Part 5. The caretaker's account of first entries were mundane repairs, gardening notes. Then they began to change. June 14th, the mistress asks me to seal the east wing cellar again. Says she heard the gurgling. Told her it's just the pipes. She knows I'm lying. The scent is stronger tonight. It settles on the skin like dupe. July 3rd. Clara, the daughter, she isn't eating much. She says the manor is feeding her something else. She keeps scratching at her arms when she thinks no one is looking. I saw a streak of green-black beneath her fingernails. JW's entries grew frantic, the script nearly illegible. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of a physical change, a sickness that was not of this world. July 18th. The mistress is obsessed with the garden. She spends hours by the old willow, talking to it. She says the sap is crying for her help. She told me she will give it what it needs. She brought the axe out today. The final entry, scrawled sideways across the last page, was the only one that truly chilled me. July 20th. They didn't flee. She fed them. She fed the ground, and now the ground is shifting. I saw the root. It had a name. I am leaving. I must leave before the sweet smell takes my lungs entirely. The cellar must not be opened. God help what's sleeping down there. The entry ended. No mention of where they went. No mention of where Clara went. I closed the book. The metallic temps of the air suddenly sharp and acrid in my nostrils. I had come looking for a scandal. I had found a story of sacrifice and unnatural feeding. I stood up, gripping the small diary. My investigation had just begun, and the cellar door, which had been mentioned twice, was now the only place I knew I could not avoid. The cold, logical Elias Thorne was gone. What remained was a man with a racing heart, trapped in a silent house that smelled fatally sweet. Chapter 2, The Shifting Shadows, Part 1. The weight of the past. The caretaker, JW, had left me with a chilling, unusable map. He hadn't described a crime. He'd described a sacrifice. A woman feeding her daughter, or something she considered her daughter, to the very soil of Blackwood. I spent the next 3 hours retracing my steps, the small leather diary in my hand, its words a cold weight against my palm. Every shadow seemed to shift, not like a trick of the eye, but like a living curtain being pulled by an invisible hand. The house was cold, but the air was humid, thick with that unbearably sweet smell, rotting fruit and metallic ozone. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It felt like it was saturating the wallpaper, weeping from the floorboards. I realized the true horror of the manor wasn't what had been done here, but what was still being done. The house was not haunted by the dead, but dominated by something monstrously, unnaturally alive. The entries in the diary mentioned Clara, the daughter, and her strange cravings, her scratching. I began to search Clara's room. It was a space frozen in time, childish, but tainted. A lace-trimmed dress lay draped across a chair, and on a nearby vanity I found a hairbrush. It was choked with long dark strands. Normal enough, until I noticed the tiny flecks of a dried green-black substance stuck within the bristles, the same color JW had written about. Part 2. The first symptom. It was then that I felt the first undeniable symptom, not fear, but a creeping, cold hunger, a gnawing emptiness that defied logic. I'd eaten well before leaving the town, yet my stomach felt hollow. It was a compulsion, a dark insistence that I needed something the standard provisions in my bag could not satisfy. I found myself moving toward the kitchen, not out of choice, but driven by a primal urge that wasn't my own. The kitchen was cleaner than the rest of the house, perhaps due to the caretaker's diligence, but even here, the odor was overpowering. On a shelf, I noticed a collection of sealed jars, labeled and neatly organized by Lenore Blackwood herself. They contained dried herbs, spices, and what appeared to be various types of rich, black soil. I opened one. The scent that rushed out was potent, concentrated, the very essence of the sweet, sickening smell that permeated the house. It wasn't merely soil. It was amended earth, mixed with something else. Something organic, rich, and deeply wrong. A momentary weakness overcame me, a bizarre, dark temptation. My fingers actually twitched toward the jar. The compulsion to taste the soil, to consume it, was terrifyingly real. I slammed the lid back down. This house wasn't just an environment. It was a symbiont, infecting the minds and bodies of those who stayed. It fed on them, and it taught them to crave the source of its own sustenance. The caretaker's hasty flight now made perfect, desperate sense. Part 3. The hidden map. JW knew the source, and he'd tried to hide it. Back in his room, I reread the last frantic line of his diary. The cellar must not be opened. A warning, yes, but also a pointer. I began tearing his small room apart, looking for anything that contradicted the stillness of the house. Beneath the cheap rug, I found a loose floorboard. Inside there wasn't gold or jewels, but a single, brittle sheet of paper. It was a rough floor plan of Blackwood Manor. Most of it was standard, but the east wing, the section JW mentioned, was marked with a heavily drawn, dark X, and leading to that X was a winding path of hastily drawn arrows, leading away from the kitchen, and down toward the ground floor of the east wing. The map indicated the cellar wasn't beneath the main house, but underneath the old servants' quarters, a separate, neglected extension of the east wing. It was a detail meant to keep the thing separate, contained, but Lenore Blackwood had clearly broken the seal. The caretaker's last act was to give me the tool to find the horror he couldn't face. My original professional curiosity had curdled into personal dread, but the journalist in me, the one obsessed with truth, could not turn back now. I had to see what the ground was shifting for. Part 4. The lock and the whispers. The walk to the east wing was long, cold and quiet, save for the whisper of the house. As I drew closer, I started to hear it, a sound beneath the constant low hum. Whispering, not words. Not a language I could pass, but a chorus of hushed, sibilant sounds, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. The map led me to a heavy oak door disguised as a pantry entrance. It was secured by a thick, rusted iron padlock. It wasn't the kind of lock meant to keep people out. It was the kind meant to keep something in. I used the set of heavy antique keys Croft had given me. They were all identical, tarnished brass, cold in my hand. It took for agonizing minutes of fumbling, the faint whispers growing louder, closer, before the final, stubborn tumbler clicked into place. The air behind the door shifted. The sweet, metallic smell intensified until it was almost painful, burning the back of my eyes. This was the threshold. Beyond this door was not a cellar for wine or potatoes, but the locus of the Blackwood Curse. Part 5. The descent. I pulled the heavy door open. The air hit me like a physical punch. Below, a set of crude, wooden steps descended into absolute, suffocating darkness. I ignited the lantern I'd brought, its flickering orange light barely cutting into the blackness. The steps were slimy, coated in a glistening viscous layer. The sweet scent here was primal, intoxicating, and down there, where the light faded, I saw it. The ground of the cellar wasn't stone or concrete. It was turned earth, rich and black, running with wet trails that glittered oddly in the lamplight. And in the center of the earthen floor, illuminated by a single, desperate cone of light, was a large, shallow, crudely dug pit. It was empty now, but the disturbed earth suggested it had recently held something large, something buried. This was where Lenore Blackwood performed her awful ritual. This was where JW last saw his duty crumble into terror. But the pit was empty. The daughter, Clara, or whatever had replaced her, was gone. I stood on the edge of the descent, the intense hunger in my gut a screaming counterpoint to the dread in my mind. I was no longer an observer. I had crossed the boundary, breathed the air, and felt the dark craving. The investigation was over. The hunt had begun, and the realization struck me with the force of a hammer. If the pit was empty, then Clara had left the cellar, and she was likely still in the house. Join me in Chapter 3, The Foundations of Sin. The darkness has begun to speak. And my body has begun to change. The Foundations of Sin, Part 1. The lure of the earthy empty pit in the cellar was a void, but it was also a promise. It proved the corruption was physical, that the curse was not a ghost, but a form of twisted, mobile botany. And whatever Lenore Blackwood had placed there, it had walked away, nourished and transformed. I didn't leave the cellar right away. The smell, so sickeningly sweet, now felt luring. The overwhelming hunger I'd felt upstairs was here, in the heart of the earth, an almost unbearable ache in my stomach. I found myself kneeling beside the pit, running my fingers through the damp, dark soil. It was impossibly fertile, heavy with nutrients. I knew with absolute, terrifying clarity that if I stayed too long, I would consume the earth. I would feed on the horror. I backed out of the cellar, slamming the heavy oak door shut and desperately scrambling to replace the iron padlock. The lock felt less like a security measure for the house, and more like a desperate shackle for me. Climbing the stairs, I felt suddenly weak, dizzy. I looked at my hands, still smeared with that slick, black soil. As I wiped them on my trousers, I saw a subtle but alarming change. The veins on the back of my hand, normally blue, were tinged with that dreadful green-black hue. The manor wasn't just infecting my mind, it was invading my blood. Part 2. Isolation and surveillance. I retreated to the parlor, sealing the doors with whatever heavy furniture I could drag across the floor. I needed to think, to regain my logic, but logic was the first casualty in Blackwood. I pulled out my notebook to document the symptoms, the timeline, the evidence, but the words on the page blurred. My vision was swimming. Time was no longer a steady stream. Minutes passed like hours, and hours vanished in a dizzying blink. This wasn't just the fever of illness. It was the influence of the house, trying to isolate my mind from my body, preparing me for the next horrifying stage of consumption. Through the windows, I saw the thick, unnatural tangle of the garden vines pressed right against the glass. They were unnaturally fast-growing, heavy, and silent. They weren't just plants, they were the manor's sensory organs. The house was watching me, waiting for me to succumb. I remembered JW's final, desperate flight. I had to leave. Now I moved to the front door, wrenching my bag onto my shoulder, but the moment I reached for the handle, a blinding, splitting headache slammed into me. Part 3. The blockade. The pain was absolute, driving me to my knees. It felt like my skull was being gripped and crushed. The world outside the manor vanished. The air, which had briefly seemed breathable, now thickened into a stifling, sweet fog. I understood then. I was no longer free to leave. Whether it was the physiological effect of the spores in the air, or the psychic domination of the root thing in the foundation, the manor had me trapped. As the pain subsided, I found myself drawn to a heavy oak sideboard, its surface coated in dust. I was hunting, instinctively, and the manor was guiding me. On the top shelf, I found what I believe was Lenore Blackwood's Genola hardbound book. Unlike JW's diary, secured with a broken clasp, her script was elegant, but her sanity was shredded. The early entries spoke of grief, the loss of her husband, the frail health of her daughter, Clara. She wrote of seeking a solution, an antidote to death itself. But the final entries, they weren't about curing Clara. They were about immortality through union. The ground is weeping for its child. It craves flesh to make its flower eternal. I have given it the servant. They are the feeders. But Clara is the vessel. Part 4. The vessel and the root. The journal revealed the full, horrific scope of her madness. Blackwood Manor was built over an ancient, subterranean root system of fungus, a parasite or something entirely outside of nature. Lenore hadn't planted it. She had nurtured it with the very lives of her household, and her daughter, Clara, frail and suffering, was meant to be the nucleus of the entity's conscious form. I flipped to the last page. Lenore's final entry was not a confession, but a triumphant observation. She described the glorious shifting of the earth as the root thing finally consumed Clara, turning her body into a vehicle. She is beautiful now. Her skin is pale and perfect, her eyes filled with the deep, nutrient knowledge of the earth. She is no longer my daughter. She is the silent bloom. This was the monster I was looking for. Not a ghost in a sheet, but a creature of flesh and flora, nourished by sin and confined by the manor's walls. And if Clara was the vessel, then she hadn't fled the house. She had become part of its foundation. I looked down at the floor where a thin, dark trail of moisture was seeping from a crack in the floorboards. The crack was directly beneath the sideboard where I found the journal. I dropped to my knees, scraping away the dust. Part 5. Breaking the seal beneath the dust. I saw that the floorboards were not only wet but slightly raised. I jammed the handle of a heavy letter opener into the crack and pried. The wood resisted, letting out a sickening, tearing sound. As the wood separated, the sweet odor exploded from the gap, suffocating me. I pulled the boards away and stared down into a tight, dark space. It wasn't the cellar. It was the space between the house and the earth, and there, in the shallow dark, I saw the network. They weren't tree roots. They were impossibly thick, moving with a slow biological rhythm, and they were wrapped around something pale, something white and soft. My mind screamed. I had found the heart of the curse, the physical manifestation of Lenore's sacrifice, right beneath my feet. But the root system hadn't just settled in the foundation. It had grown. I heard it then, a sound I hadn't noticed before, coming from somewhere above and behind me. A slow, heavy scrape. I twisted around, the lantern light shaking violently in my hand, illuminating the dark entrance hall. And there, standing at the top of the main staircase, illuminated by the fading afternoon light, was a figure. Pale, thin, and moving with the unsettling stillness of a machine that has just been oiled. It was Clara, the silent bloom. I had found the daughter. But the daughter was no longer Clara. She was the sentinel of the soil. Join me in Chapter 4, The Harvest, as I must now face the terrible vessel, and find a way to destroy the root that has claimed my body as its next sacrifice. Harvest. Part 1. The silent bloom. Clara. The name was a fragile memory, clinging to a form that was anything but. She stood at the top of the stairs, unmoving. Her skin was the color of old bone, translucent, almost luminous in the dim light. Her eyes, though open, were a vacant, milky white, reflecting nothing. But it was her hair that truly chilled me. What had once been dark, flowing locks was now a tangled mass of thin, fibrous tendrils, interspersed with fragments of dry leaves and tiny, green-black fungal growths that pulsed with a faint, unholy light. She began to descend, one slow, deliberate step at a time. No footsteps, no sound, only the dry, almost imperceptible clicking that seemed to emanate from her, like the sound of a chitinous insect shifting its exoskeleton. The hunger in my gut intensified, turning into a burning agony. The green-black veins on my hands now visibly pulsed, creeping up my forearms. The manor was pulling at me, demanding I surrender, demanding I become another offering. But seeing Clara, seeing the complete, grotesque transformation, ignited a desperate spark of defiance. This was not a passive haunting, this was a physical infection, and she was its primary vector. Part 2. The harvest's grasp. I backed away, my lantern light shaking, casting wild, dancing shadows that made the house seem to writhe. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was a suffocating pressure, a silent command from the root dot as she reached the bottom step. The air around her visibly shimmered like heat rising from parched earth. And then, without warning, the vines from the overgrown garden outside slammed against the windows, not with the force of wind, but with deliberate, sentient impact. They weren't just outside. The small, hairline cracks in the walls began to widen, and thin, dark, hair-like roots started to snake their way through the plaster, growing with alarming speed, reaching for me. The house itself was attacking. Clara stopped, her blank eyes fixed on me. And then, from her open mouth, a low, guttural chittering sound emerged, a sound not human, but of something ancient and primal, like roots grinding against stone. She lunged, not with human speed, but with an unnatural, gliding momentum. I barely managed to dodge her, rolling beneath a heavy writing desk, the lantern clattering to the floor but miraculously staying lit. The roots in the floorboards beneath the sideboard, where I'd uncovered the network, throbbed violently. I realized Clara wasn't just chasing me, she was herding me, pushing me towards the place where the root was strongest, where it waited to complete its harvest. Part 3. The price of knowledge. My mind was a battlefield. The hunger in my stomach roared, a constant, sickening counterpoint to the fear. The green-black lines on my skin were now a spiderweb, visible even in the dim light. My senses were warping. The sweet smell was now overwhelming, almost intoxicating. I knew the manor wanted to absorb me, to add my consciousness, my flesh, to its growing network. I scrambled away from the desk, grabbing the lantern. Clara was moving faster now, her blank eyes tracking my every move with terrifying precision. I saw my reflection in a large, antique mirror. My face was pale, drawn, and my eyes, in the flickering light, seemed too wide, too dark, and around my pupils, a faint, undeniable greenish ring had formed. I remembered Lenore's journal, immortality through union. This wasn't just a parasitic attack, it was an attempt at creating a hive consciousness, a new form of life rooted in the land, powered by human essence. Clara was the first, but the entity yearned for more. The roots that burst from the walls were now thicker, tangling around furniture, pulling paintings from their hooks. They sought to entrap me, to slow me down. The entire house was alive, a living, breathing entity closing in. I had to find the source, not the roots, not Clara, but the core of the entity, the single point from which it drew its unholy power. Part 4. The old willow. My memory, fractured by the manor's influence, suddenly snagged on another of JW's entries. Echoed in Lenore's journal, the mistress is obsessed with the garden. She spends hours by the old willow talking to it. She says the sap is crying for her help. She told me she will give it what it needs. The old willow, the oldest, largest tree on the estate, near the overgrown back garden, the manor's connection to the outside, the true anchor of the root thing. I had to get outside, but Clara was between me and the main entrance. I burst through the kitchen, shattering a window with a desperate swing of my arm, glass showering the floor. The chill night air hit me, momentarily clearing my head, but the sweet smell outside was even stronger, almost dizzying. The garden was a maze of thorny, mutated plants, all swaying unnaturally, and there, looming in the distance, was the old willow. Its branches, thick as human limbs, drooped almost to the ground, surrounded by a swirling mist that seemed to emanate from its base. Clara was behind me, her chittering call echoing from the broken window, driving me forward. The roots in the soil beneath my feet were no longer passive. They were grabbing, tripping, trying to pull me down. Part 5. The offering. I ran, desperate, stumbling over the snaking roots, tearing my clothes, the green-black spreading rapidly across my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps. The manor wanted me to join it, to become one with its collective consciousness, to contribute my life force to its eternal bloom. The old willow loomed. Its bark was impossibly dark, wet with a viscous, sweet-smelling sap that glistened in the moonlight, and at its base, I saw it, not an opening, but a groove in the bark, a dark, pulsing fissure, leaking that sickly sweet sap. It was a mouth, a wound, or an altar. And then I saw her, Lenore Blackwood, or what was left of her. Her withered, desiccated body was half embedded in the willow's trunk, her arms outstretched, her eyes wide with a serene, terrifying devotion. She had given herself entirely. Clara emerged from the mist, her chittering call now directly behind me. The ground beneath the willow began to tremble. The roots, bursting from the soil around me, thickened and tightened, holding me fast. I was the next offering, the final harvest, but I held the lantern, and I remembered JW's frantic final words. God help what's sleeping down there. My flesh was turning, my will was fading, but if I was to be sacrificed, I would take the entity with me. Join me in Chapter 5, Echoes and Dust, as I confront the very heart of the Blackwood Curse, and discover the true meaning of its eternal bloom. Chapter 5, Echoes and Dust. Part 1. The final sacrament. The roots held me fast. My body felt heavy, alien. The green-black webbing on my skin was now a cold, throbbing membrane, my veins screaming in resistance. Clara, the silent bloom, stood inches from me, her pale hand reaching out for my face, ready to administer the final, fatal kiss of the manor's poison. But the hunger that had tormented me was now clarity. The root wanted me to consume the earth, to join its collective mind. I realized my connection to the curse was also my only weapon. Lenore Blackwood's withered corpse, embedded in the willow's trunk, was the proof. This was not immortality, it was consumption. The willow wasn't giving life, it was absorbing souls into a state of vegetative hell. I tightened my grip on the lantern. The entity, the root thing, communicated through the sweet smell, through the craving, and through the low, insistent drone that hammered in my ears. I knew it wanted to save its vessel, Clara, and protect the source of its power, the groove in the willow's bark. Clara's hand finally touched my cheek. It was freezing, dry, and surprisingly frail. But in that touch, the willow spoke, pouring visions of endless, dark, nutrient-rich peace directly into my mind. Join us, Elias. Be safe. Be eternal. Part 2. The fire of defiance. I screamed, not in pain, but in defiance. I brought the heavy, oil-filled lantern down with all my remaining strength, shattering the glass base against the rough bark near the willow's pulsing fissure. The oil splashed the trunk, the exposed, throbbing fissure, and the dark, wet sap. In a single, blinding flash, the willow erupted in flame. The heat was staggering, but the roots holding me slackened instantly. Clara shrieked, a sound not of agony, but of infuriated loss. Her fragile, root-laced body was violently repelled by the fire, stumbling backwards into the toxic mist. The drone of the willow turned into a hideous, high-pitched scream of agony, the sound of a living thing being violently severed from its body. The green-black substance on my arms began to shrivel and blister. Recoiling from the heat, I tore myself free of the last grasping roots and stumbled away, watching the flames devour the anchor of the curse. Lenore Blackwood's form, consumed by the fire, became a brief silhouette of ash. Part 3. The destruction and the dust. The air, momentarily cleansed by the intensity of the heat, suddenly lost its sick sweet scent. The oppressive humidity lifted. The roots writhing in the ground went still, turning brittle and dry in the incredible heat. It was over. The root was burning. The Blackwood Curse was being reduced to ash and steam. I turned back to the manor. The entire structure seemed to sigh, to settle. The vines that had assaulted the windows went limp, retracting and turning brown. The grotesque, unnatural life had been snuffed out. I found Clara near the smoking remains. She was still, utterly lifeless. The fibrous growths in her hair were rapidly drying, turning to dust. The luminous pallor of her skin had faded to the brittle gray of a dried flower. She wasn't healed. The thing that inhabited her was dead, and the vessel died with it. The silent bloom had completed its cycle. I had come for a story, and I had left with the absolute truth, etched into the ruin of the Blackwood estate. I had destroyed the core. I was free. Part 4. The unbearable Costi stumbled back to the abandoned carriage, the taste of smoke and victory sour in my mouth. My clothes were torn, my body bruised, but I was alive. I had survived the harvest. I drove away from Blackwood Manor as dawn began to paint the sky, never looking back. I was driven by a single purpose: to report the truth to Mr. Croft, to ensure the estate was sealed forever. But the further I traveled, the more the cold, rational world seemed distant. The veins on my arms were receding, the green-black fading, but the hunger did not go away. It merely changed. It grew deeper, more profound. I tried to eat the provisions in my bag: dried beef, hard biscuits. They tasted like sand. They offered no satisfaction. My body had learned to crave something else, something richer, something living. I had defeated the root thing, but not before it had rooted a seed deep within my physiology. A subtle, parasitic hunger for the unnatural. Part 5. The echoes and the bloom. I finally reached a remote farmhouse that morning, seeking help. The old woman who answered the door was kind, but nervous. Her garden was overgrown, but filled with normal, healthy roses and herbs. As she spoke, asking if I needed a doctor, I looked down at her healthy, dark soil. The hunger was unbearable. The world was dull, colorless, lifeless. Only the earth, only the nutrient-rich darkness, promised satisfaction. I looked at my reflection in the window. The green ring around my pupils was gone, but my eyes were too bright. I was a man of logic, a man of facts, but now, I was an empty vessel, driven by a primal, alien need. I didn't destroy the root, I simply brought it home. I carried the echo of the Blackwood Curse, the terrible, consuming seed, within my very blood. I was no longer Elias Thorne, journalist. I was the new silent bloom, the final, unstoppable harvest, and the world, so full of beautiful, fertile earth, was waiting to be fed. The story of Blackwood Manor is over, but the root is always seeking new soil.